land of Mesopotamia burns the lungs with every breath, and thick, suffocating dust hangs in the scorching air. It is June 26, 363, and the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate looks on as the smouldering remains of his own river fleet burn out. He personally ordered the ships carrying supplies to be burned, forcing his legions to march only forward, deep into enemy territory. This decision, driven by desperation and pride, will forever go down in history as the epitome of a fatal military blunder. The finest infantry of the ancient world suddenly realized with horror that they were trapped in a boundless desert with no route of retreat. A few days later, Julian would be fatally wounded in the stomach by a spear thrown by an unknown horseman, and the empire would sign a humiliating peace treaty. But to understand how the greatest military machine of antiquity fell into this trap time and again over the course of 700 years, we need to shift our perspective. American generals experienced exactly the same shock in the mountains of Afghanistan when they realized that their technological superiority was utterly useless. Today, we will examine the systemic error of the world's strongest armies, which attempted to destroy the enemy using a type of force foreign to it. The Roman Empire was accustomed to solving its problems with a single universal tool that had worked flawlessly for centuries. That tool was the heavy infantry of the legions, capable of marching in the thousands, building impregnable camps, and crushing any enemy in close combat. The Celts, the Germanic tribes, the Macedonian phalanx, and the Carthaginian mercenaries, all of them tried to play the same close-quarters game as Rome and inevitably lost. The legions operated like a giant ancient paver, slowly but inexorably encasing any foreign culture in concrete. In Europe, this tactic of direct pressure, wielding the giant rectangular scutum shield and the short gladius sword, ran like clockwork. But it was precisely this total success that laid the foundation for the empire's future catastrophes in the East. Roman generals, educated on the works of historians such as Polybius, sincerely believed in the absolute superiority of their military system. They believed that there was simply no military challenge in the world that could not be solved through proper geometric formation and strict discipline. This confidence in the invincibility of heavy infantry turned into a dangerous dogma that overshadowed any objective problems. The Senate in Rome thought in European terms, where victory goes to whoever holds the line better and strikes harder. No one in the command tents wanted to admit that their ideal system had geographical limitations. In 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus decided that Parthia would be his personal stepping stone to eternal glory. As the wealthiest man in the Republic and the conqueror of Spartacus, he was desperately envious of the military triumphs of Caesar and Pompey. Crassus literally bought himself an entire army, mustering 7 legions, and set off eastward in search of a quick victory. Yet the 60-year-old commander had absolutely no real experience conducting long campaigns in an arid climate. He led nearly 40,000 well-armed infantrymen into the open steppe near Carrhae, expecting a classic decisive battle. Crassus planned simply to find the enemy army, force it into close combat, rout it, and annex new territories. And this is where things get really interesting, because the reality of the Middle East instantly shattered all Roman assumptions. The enemy simply did not show up for this war in the form that the heavy European infantry had expected. The young and brilliant Parthian commander, Sharina, fielded just 10,000 mounted archers against the ironclad Roman army. Instead of the barbarians' battle cries, the legionaries heard the blood-curdling roar of hundreds of Parthian drums with bronze bells. This sound was the first stage of psychological warfare, designed to shatter the soldiers' nerves even before the battle began. Plutarch wrote that this rumble resembled both the roar of wild beasts and the rumble of thunder. From the perspective of Roman military strategy, light cavalry without infantry support was physically incapable of winning a major battle. Therefore, Crassus ordered his troops to reform into a tight defensive square, anticipating a head-on assault or a swift attack from the flanks. But Sharina had no intention of engaging in close combat, where his men would be instantly annihilated. He planned to use the vastness of the desert to turn a classic battle into a long-distance slaughter lasting many hours. The Parthians simply began circling the Roman square, never coming within the throwing range of a heavy Roman pilum. The Roman geometry of survival had turned into a gigantic, stationary target the size of a soccer field, one that was impossible to miss. The horror of the situation lay in the lethality of the Parthians' composite bows, made of wood, horn, and tendons. These ancient sniper rifles fired heavy arrows with such force that they easily pierced Roman shields and chainmail. When Crassus's legionaries attempted to launch sorties and counterattack, the horsemen simply retreated without ceasing fire. They shot directly from the saddle over their shoulders, using their famous Parthian shot, which became the bane of the legions. The soldiers stood for hours under the scorching Mesopotamian sun, dying of thirst and taking steel arrowheads to their faces and limbs. The massive Roman shield ceased to be a reliable shelter, turning into a heavy board studded with dozens of arrows. The psychological pressure on the men trapped in formation exceeded any human limits of endurance. The commander-in-chief's son, Publius Crassus, attempted to break through the encirclement with a detachment of Gallic cavalry, but was cut off and annihilated. The Parthians impaled the young officer's head on a spear and, in a mocking gesture, paraded it right in front of the ranks of the stunned legionaries. At that moment, the exemplary Roman discipline began to falter, because the system offered the soldiers no way out. You cannot catch up to the enemy, you cannot hide from the arrows, and you cannot simply walk away from this scorching furnace. The mightiest army of antiquity found itself completely paralyzed by an enemy who cold-bloodedly refused to play by its rules. Sounds strikingly familiar, doesn't it? Let's fast forward 2,000 years to the Koringal Valley in Afghanistan, which the US military dubbed the Valley of Death. US troops entered the area equipped with the world's best armored vehicles, thermal imaging devices, aircraft, and satellite communications. The Pentagon expected that its overwhelming technological and firepower would force any local resistance to lay down its arms quickly. But the Taliban did not build large bases and never engaged in open firefights with Marine battalions. They exploited the rugged mountain terrain, fired from hidden positions, and instantly blended in with the civilian population. Like Crassus's legionnaires, modern soldiers found themselves held hostage by their own heavy and cumbersome gear. The Americans patrolled the mountains in 30-kilogram Kevlar body armor under the same merciless, scorching sun. Their enemy wore light clothing, traveled by motorcycle, and knew every mountain trail. A mighty empire once again faced an enemy that nullified the technological gap through asymmetric tactics. An American infantryman with an M4 rifle felt the same rage and helplessness as a Roman with his gladius. Possessing the most advanced close-quarters weapon is absolutely useless if you physically cannot reach the shooter. The final moments of the Battle of Carrhae became one of the most shameful chapters in the history of the Roman Empire. The Romans lost 20,000 men killed, another 10,000 were taken prisoner, and the Parthians forced Crassus himself to swallow molten gold. This colossal systemic failure should have forced the Senate to completely rethink its strategy in the East. But instead of making painful adjustments, Rome decided that the problem lay solely with an incompetent commander and the cowardice of the soldiers. They reached the same arrogant conclusion as analysts in Washington did after the first setbacks in the Middle East. The empire began preparing new expeditions without even suspecting the logistical abyss into which it was about to step. Rome conquered not with sharp swords, but with paved roads, reliable warehouses, and uninterrupted food supplies. For 40,000 soldiers to kill enemies every day, they needed to consume about 10 metric tons of grain daily. In Europe, the legions advanced, built stone highways, hauled heavy supply trains, and transformed the wild forest into a part of civilization. This system ran like a well-oiled Swiss watch. Wherever a Roman boot stepped, infrastructure immediately followed. War became a precise engineering problem, in which victory went to whoever was better at digging trenches and building bridges. But in the East, this flawless European mechanism came up against a geography that became the Parthians' chief ally. The military theorist Vigetius wrote that armies perish far more often from a lack of provisions than in open battle. Roman quartermasters calculated that one legion required about 12,000 kilograms of wheat daily simply for basic survival. The reformer Gaius Marius forced soldiers to carry part of their supplies on their backs to relieve the burden on the slow-moving supply trains, even if only slightly. It was no coincidence that the legionaries were nicknamed Marius's mules, as they carried rations for 3 or 4 days' march on their backs. In fertile Gaul, Julius Caesar easily made up for the lack of food by plundering local villages and seizing Celtic granaries. However, beyond the Euphrates River, this classic strategy of foraging immediately came up against the harsh reality of the rocky desert. Mesopotamia and the Iranian highlands are not like the European plains, where you can scoop up clean water with your helmet from any stream. This is 1,000 kilometers of merciless wasteland where daytime temperatures easily exceed 40 degrees Celsius. There was a catastrophic shortage of trees here for building fortified camps and siege engines, which threw the entire Roman engineering system into disarray. A legionary who felt right at home in the German forests was reduced here to a prisoner dying of dehydration. Instead of marching on a solid road, soldiers sank into the scorching sand, their feet rubbed raw and bleeding under the weight of their armor. The hostile environment sapped the heavy infantry's strength even before a single armed enemy appeared on the horizon. The Parthians were well aware of their vulnerability in direct combat and used nature itself as a weapon of mass destruction. They employed brutal scorched earth tactics, systematically destroying absolutely all resources in the path of the imperial armies. Nomadic raiding parties buried the few oases with sand, poisoned wells with animal carcasses, and burned the meager pastures. The Romans simply had no way to send detachments out for food, because they would be instantly slaughtered by the Parthian cavalry. The mighty army found itself in a complete logistical vacuum, where every step deeper into enemy territory brought it closer to starvation. The Parthians did not need to attack the legions head-on. It was enough for them simply to ride ahead and burn the grass. Roman supply trains, laden with grain, tents, and heavy siege weapons, moved at a snail's pace. They relied on cumbersome wagons drawn by slow oxen, which covered at most 15 kilometers a day. Amid sandstorms and the lack of roads, this supply line became unwieldy and incredibly vulnerable. The Parthian army, consisting exclusively of light cavalry, easily covered distances 3 or 4 times greater in the same amount of time. They attacked the stretched-out supply columns, burned the food wagons, and vanished without a trace into the sand dunes. The Romans resembled a steel-clad giant, slowly dying of exhaustion, chasing ghosts to no avail. And here, history takes yet another unexpected turn, proving the immutability of the laws of logistics in asymmetric warfare. The American war machine in the mountains of Afghanistan built its strategy on exactly the same fundamental principles of supply. For a single modern Marine to patrol a valley safely, a massive supply chain had to be operating behind him. The US brought its own infrastructure with it, attempting to transform the wild landscape into a comfortable forward operating base. They built concrete shelters, brought in air conditioners, installed internet, and provided soldiers with hot meals 3 times a day. Like Rome, the modern superpower sought to conquer not only the enemy, but also the hostile landscape itself, with money. But the longer these high-tech supply lines became, the more vulnerable the entire military campaign became. Pentagon logisticians calculated that delivering 1 gallon of gasoline to a remote outpost cost taxpayers $400. Huge convoys of fuel tankers and supply trucks were forced to crawl slowly along narrow, mine-laden mountain roads. The Taliban did not need to storm well-fortified bases, exposing themselves to attacks by combat helicopters and artillery. It was enough for them to paralyze the roads with improvised explosive devices, forcing the empire to bleed money and resources. Both armies, separated by 2,000 years of history, became hostages to their own comfort and their inability to wage war without a massive logistical base. As the Romans moved further away from their supply depots in Syria, their combat effectiveness declined exponentially. Even when the legions won local skirmishes, they simply could not hold territory due to plain and simple starvation. Modern military analysts call this the limit of anticipation, the point beyond which an advancing army can no longer sustain itself. Time and again, Roman commanders ran up against this invisible barrier, losing 1,000 experienced veterans to dysentery. The Parthians were aware of this critical weakness and simply waited for mighty Rome to exhaust itself through fruitless forced marches. It was a classic war of attrition, in which the empire's vast resources were consumed faster than they could yield results. It was precisely this logistical blindness that caused each new generation of Roman strategists to repeat the same mistakes. In the capital, they stubbornly believed that the logistical problem could be solved solely through sheer willpower and the personal example of the commander. Before his death, Julius Caesar planned a grand campaign against Parthia, firmly believing in the unbreakable power of Roman arms. The dictator was convinced that his tactical genius and the loyalty of his veterans would easily overcome the basic laws of geography. But even if Caesar had survived, he would inevitably have faced the same supply impasse. A lack of water and fodder cannot be compensated for even by the most brilliant speeches to the troops or severe corporal punishment. The Roman army had turned into a heavy diving suit that works flawlessly on the flat seabed of the European Ocean. But clad in this protective gear, politicians stubbornly tried to force their soldiers to win a marathon lasting many days in a sandy desert. For decades, the empire ignored objective reality, refusing to reform its cumbersome logistics system. The Senate continued to send 40,000 infantrymen to the east at a time, hoping that the next expedition would be more successful than the previous ones. And this fatal incompatibility between ambition and logistics was most clearly evident during the reign of the empire's most warlike emperor. Enter a man whose conquests seemed an absolute triumph but turned out to be Rome's greatest strategic failure. Emperor Trajan was the quintessence of the Roman military spirit, combining the toughness of a veteran with the pragmatism of a brilliant logistician. In 114 CE, he decided to settle the Eastern question once and for all by assembling a colossal army for a large-scale invasion. Trajan had absolutely no desire to repeat Crassus's naive mistakes, so he approached the task with the maniacal meticulousness of an engineer. He ordered the forests of Syria to be cleared in order to build massive river flotillas on the Euphrates River for the uninterrupted supply of provisions. It seemed that the perfect Roman war machine had finally adapted, transforming a desert campaign into a meticulously planned water expedition. At first, the campaign looked like a flawless ancient blitzkrieg, leaving the enemy no chance to resist. The legions advanced rapidly, effortlessly sweeping aside small Parthian garrisons and capturing ancient cities one after another. Trajan became the first and only Roman ruler to triumphantly reach the very shores of the Persian Gulf. There, standing by the water, he lamented that he was too old to march to India in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. The proud old man sincerely believed that a centuries-old problem had been solved and that the rebellious East had been subjugated to the Roman eagle forever. But it was precisely at this moment of triumph that the greatest strategic trap in the empire's history snapped shut. The main ingenuity of the Parthian defensive system lay in the very structure of their unique decentralized state. Parthia was never a rigidly structured empire of the Roman type, where the fall of the capital automatically meant the surrender of the entire country. For a Roman, the capture of the main city was equivalent to checkmate in a game of chess, after which the enemy was obliged to lay down its arms. But for the nomadic Parthians, their magnificent capital, Ctesiphon, was merely a convenient winter camp, not the sacred heart of the nation. The Romans simply seized empty buildings, applying European logic of victory to a society that lived by an entirely different paradigm. While Trajan was organizing parades in the deserted palace, the Parthian kings coolly retreated to the inaccessible Iranian highlands. They took with them what was most valuable in war: their light cavalry, experienced commanders, and mobile resources. The legions seized a vast swath of Iraqi territory, but failed to destroy the enemy's manpower, which rendered all their conquests utterly meaningless. Trying to defeat the Parthians by simply capturing cities is like trying to catch fog with your bare hands. Occupying vast expanses proved easy, but holding on to this seething cauldron of hostility was physically impossible. The comparison with the present day is obvious. One need only recall 2001 and the coalition forces' triumphant entry into Kabul. The US military crushed the Taliban's official forces in just a few weeks, relying on total technological superiority and assault aviation. Politicians in Washington jubilantly celebrated the final victory at the time, confident that the modern army had permanently reshaped the Middle East. But the Taliban acted exactly like the ancient Parthians. They simply vanished into the mountains and retreated to neighboring Pakistan. Both Western empires realized too late that winning a formal war and securing peaceful control are two entirely different tasks. As soon as Trajan's massive army dispersed into small garrisons to control the conquered provinces, the enemy sprang into action. Control of the capital ceased to mean anything because the Parthians controlled all the endless desert roads surrounding it. Roving detachments of mounted archers began methodically cutting off the supply lines established by the Romans, leaving the forward bases without provisions. They never stormed fortified stone walls, preferring to destroy supply trains and vanish instantly beyond the horizon. Roman legionaries found themselves trapped in fortresses, transformed from victors into exhausted hostages of their own conquests. In addition to attacks from the outside, massive anti-Roman uprisings broke out deep in the Roman rear. Trajan suddenly found himself in a vast territory where every local resident hated the occupiers and actively aided the guerrillas. The situation was exacerbated by large-scale Jewish revolts that swept through Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and Egypt, requiring the urgent deployment of additional troops to suppress them. The great army's strength was not sapped by epic cinematic battles, but by 1,000 small ambushes and outbreaks of dysentery. The soldiers were driven mad by the constant stress, unable to discern where the front line lay in this war without rules. The emperor, who just a few months earlier had considered himself the absolute ruler of the world, was forced to order a humiliating retreat. He tried to save face by laying siege to the small desert town of Hatra, but his exhausted legions could not even take this tiny fortress. The scorching sun and lack of drinking water finally wore down the besiegers, forcing the Romans to abandon their heavy siege engines and retreat. Trajan fell gravely ill on the journey and died in 117 CE, never making it back to Rome alive. The greatest commander had passed away, leaving behind only the bitter illusion of a victory that had already turned to ashes. It fell to his successor, Emperor Hadrian, to deal with the consequences of this logistical disaster, and he made a decision that was incredibly painful for the Roman ego. He soberly assessed the supply impasse and ordered the legions to immediately withdraw from all the eastern territories conquered by Trajan. The army withdrew in an orderly fashion to the old, tried-and-true borders along the Euphrates River, voluntarily ceding all conquered territory to the enemy. Hadrian became the first ruler to officially acknowledge that the empire had reached the physical limit of its expansion in Asia. Heavy infantry could effectively defend static borders, but it was inherently incapable of controlling a mobile, nomadic population. It was a moment of rare political insight when Rome acknowledged that its universal military instrument had finally been shattered by geography. However, this harsh lesson was all too quickly forgotten in the halls of the Senate, giving way to a new wave of imperial hubris. Subsequent rulers tried time and again to break through the same invisible logistical wall in the scorching sands. Each new Caesar firmly believed that his strict discipline and tactical genius alone could defy the basic laws of survival. And the most tragic example of this institutional stubbornness was the fate of the man who went down in history as the philosopher emperor. Marcus Aurelius went down in history as a stoic ruler who abhorred bloodshed, yet spent most of his life in military camps. When, in 161, Parthian cavalry suddenly crossed the Euphrates and routed the Roman garrisons in Syria, the philosopher was forced to set aside his scrolls. He dispatched an unprecedented contingent of 3 European legions to the east, under the formal command of his co-ruler, Lucius Verus. The emperor sincerely believed that strict Roman methodicalness and cold reason were capable of overcoming any irrational eastern chaos. The army did indeed muster its forces, establish supply lines, and slowly but surely advance deep into enemy territory. This expedition seemed like a triumphant return to the glorious days of the great conquests of the past. Under the leadership of the talented commander Avidius Cassius, the legionaries broke through the enemy's defenses and, in 165, reached the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon once again. The Roman soldiers destroyed the royal palace, burned entire neighborhoods to the ground, and proudly proclaimed their unconditional victory. The massive army set out on its return journey, laden with tons of gold and silver and thousands of captive slaves. But this time, the East had prepared a blow for Rome that proved 100 times more terrifying than any Parthian armor-piercing arrow. Along with their spoils, the returning veterans brought back from Mesopotamia an invisible and utterly merciless killer. The Antonine plague broke out in the Roman camps. According to modern epidemiologists, it was a deadly strain of smallpox. This biological echo of a distant campaign swept along all trade routes, instantly devastating the densely populated empire. By historians' most conservative estimates, the pandemic killed up to 5 million people, including a massive portion of the once invincible army itself. The Romans sincerely believed they had subdued Parthia for good, but in reality, their brilliant invasion triggered an internal apocalypse. Asymmetric war of attrition always carries enormous hidden costs that generals do not include in their victory reports. You send 100,000 soldiers to resolve an external geopolitical problem, only to end up with a devastated society within your own country. Roman cities were deserted, there was no one left to harvest the crops in the fields, and tax revenues to the treasury fell by a factor of 3. The economy of this vast state collapsed under the weight of the consequences of a war that had originally been planned as a swift punitive operation. And here we see a frightening historical parallel with the events of the early 21st century. In the 21st century, the United States faced a similar effect of devastating backlash after 20 years of a grueling campaign in Afghanistan. American soldiers did not bring home the plague, but the country was left with tens of thousands of veterans suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The US military medical system was overwhelmed as it struggled to cope with an epidemic of suicides among former combatants. The financial cost of this distant war exceeded $2 trillion, leaving future generations with colossal national debts. Asymmetric conflicts drain the stronger side in precisely this way, by siphoning off resources from within, while politicians tell the public about tactical successes. Marcus Aurelius learned from his own bitter experience how quickly imperial reserves dwindle under such conditions. To finance the defense of the northern borders against the Germanic tribes, in 169, the emperor was forced to hold an unprecedented sale. The ruler of Rome put his personal jewels, gold cups, and even the empress's silk garments up for public auction in Trajan's forum. The East acted like a giant black hole that methodically devoured resources, even when Rome was formally winning every battle. Parthia remained unconquered, simply because its apparent weakness and poverty were its main strategic defenses. The most striking aspect of this centuries-long drama is that Roman military strategists fully understood the essence of what was happening. Theorists such as the general Arrian wrote detailed tactical treatises on how to counter maneuverable mounted archers. Staff officers persistently advised the widespread use of mobile slingers and an urgent increase in the proportion of their own heavy cavalry. They understood that to survive in the desert, the army had to become faster, lighter, and learn to strike from long distances. However, an insurmountable institutional chasm lay between a theoretical understanding of the strategic problem and actual military reforms. It was simply impossible to restructure an army that had been built around the heavy infantryman with a massive shield for 500 years. The entire Roman culture, the logistics economy, and the social hierarchy were inextricably tied to the classical infantry legions. For the senators, abandoning head-on combat tactics would have meant a painful renunciation of the very foundation of Roman identity. The Pentagon has also been studying the bitter lessons of Vietnam and Afghanistan for decades, regularly issuing new counterinsurgency doctrines. But the core of the American military machine remains stubbornly geared toward high-tech, conventional conflicts with clear geopolitical objectives. Empires are always too unwieldy to change their fundamental nature for the sake of a single, albeit very complex, theater of operations. The Roman general staff preferred to accept regular bloody losses in the east rather than completely dismantle their victorious European war machine. Instead of structural reforms, the Romans built a chain of border forts and watchtowers along the Syrian desert, calling it the Limes Arabicus. This was a classic strategy of containment, a desperate attempt to wall themselves off with a high stone wall from a problem the legions could not solve by the sword. The government sought to maintain an illusory status quo in an unstable region where peace had never truly existed. Soldiers carried out their routine duties in these dusty garrisons, gradually losing their vigilance and growing accustomed to the monotony of border patrols. But while Rome blindly tried to hold these artificial borders, a quiet and fateful revolution was taking place deep in the east. The weak and fragile dynasty of Parthian rulers collapsed under the fierce onslaught of internal conflicts in 224. This political catastrophe made the geopolitical situation for the scattered border legions 10 times more desperate. In the wake of a fragmented Parthia, a new, far more aggressive and terrifying power rapidly emerged, ready to redraw the map of the ancient world. In 224 CE, the political landscape of the East, familiar to the Romans, suddenly collapsed. The fragile Parthian Sassanid dynasty finally fell under the blows of the ambitious ruler Ardashir I, who founded the new Sassanid Empire. For Rome, this was not merely a routine change of ruling family among its restless neighbors, but a qualitative leap in the level of military threat. The Parthians were decentralized nomads who often lacked the political organization necessary for prolonged sieges and the systematic holding of territory. The Sassanids, however, quickly built a tightly centralized state with a powerful bureaucracy, a professional army, and a regular tax collection system. The new dynasty brought with it not only internal order, but also an aggressive state ideology based on ancient Zoroastrianism. The Sassanid monarchs officially declared their unconditional historical rights to all the former territories of the vast Achaemenid Empire. This meant that they openly laid claim to Roman Syria, the wealthiest Egypt, and virtually all of Asia Minor. Border skirmishes instantly escalated into a large-scale religious and political confrontation between two superpowers vying for global geopolitical dominance. Roman commanders suddenly found themselves face to face, not with pesky steppe guerrillas, but with a highly organized rival state. And this powerful rival had a completely new, deadly approach to waging full-scale war. The Sassanid war machine wisely retained the best of its predecessors, incredible strategic mobility and deadly mounted archers. But to this already vexing threat, they added heavy shock cavalry, capable of physically breaking the famous Roman infantry formation in a head-on clash. The Persians deployed cataphracts en masse onto the battlefields, elite horsemen completely clad in heavy plate or scale armor. Not only were the warriors themselves clad in sturdy steel from head to toe, but so were their massive war horses. Outwardly, these heavily armed units closely resembled classic medieval knights, except that they appeared 1,000 years before the Crusades, whereas Roman infantry had previously been able to simply take cover behind large wooden shields from a hail of arrows and wait for the Parthians to retreat. This tactic no longer worked. The Sassanids employed a perfect combination of tactics against which the Roman classical manipule simply had no adequate geometric response. First, 1,000 light archers literally showered the legion with arrows, forcing the infantrymen to huddle into the tightest, least mobile defensive formation possible. As soon as the legionaries lost their maneuverability, steel-clad monsters wielding 4-meter spears charged at full gallop. The impact of this colossal mass of metal, traveling at tremendous speed, easily pierced the shields and physically tore the monolithic formation into bloody pieces. In exactly the same way, the tactics of modern insurgents change rapidly when they unexpectedly gain access to new, cutting-edge technologies. In Afghanistan, the Taliban began their long guerrilla campaign with rusty Soviet assault rifles and primitive homemade roadside bombs. But by the end of the protracted conflict, these same people were actively using thermal imagers, captured night vision devices, and commercial drones. The evolution of the enemy in asymmetric warfare always proceeds much faster, because militants learn from their mistakes every day, simply to survive. Persian commanders, too, learned from the blood of their forefathers. methodically devising a mathematically precise tactical antidote to Roman infantry superiority. A vast empire, however, always learns painfully slowly, being firmly shackled by bureaucracy, court intrigues, and a sacred faith in old academic doctrines. Roman staff generals continued to think in terms of ancient victories, categorically refusing to acknowledge that their universal soldier was rapidly becoming obsolete before their very eyes. Shapur I, the second king of kings of the Sassanid Empire, brilliantly exploited this institutional Roman inflexibility, becoming a veritable nightmare for Roman Syria. He cold-bloodedly proved to the Senate that the revitalized Eastern army could now not only flee into the desert, but also trample the vaunted legions into the mud. His audacious military ambitions ultimately led to a catastrophic event that seemed utterly unthinkable in the civilized ancient world. In the year 260 CE, a massive Roman army under the command of Emperor Valerian himself clashed with Shapur's forces at Edessa. By that fateful moment, the Roman legions had been severely depleted by yet another outbreak of an epidemic and the appalling logistical support for this distant campaign. The Sassanid heavy cavalry, in a deadly combination with agile archers, encircled the vast Roman camp in a tight ring, completely cutting off all access to drinking water. Tormented by terrible thirst and disease, the heavy infantry attempted to break through the iron blockade, but was methodically mowed down from a safe distance and mercilessly trampled. As a result of this brutal local slaughter, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or taken into permanent slavery, and Shapur accomplished the utterly impossible. The most crushing blow to the Roman imperial ego was that the living Emperor Valerian found himself a personal, powerless slave of the Persian king. It was a truly unprecedented historical disgrace. The ruler of half the known world, in iron shackles, humiliatingly bowed to an Eastern barbarian ruler. According to shocking accounts by ancient contemporaries, Shapur used the chained Roman emperor for many years as a living stool so he could mount his horse in comfort. When Valerian finally died quietly in disgraceful captivity, the Persians flayed him and stuffed his skin with straw for the amusement of foreign ambassadors. This monstrous culture shock forced Rome to seek salvation in a panic, and the empire's wounded pride demanded immediate technological revenge on the battlefield. The desperate Romans began feverishly copying Persian tactics, hastily creating their own expensive units of cataphracts and significantly increasing the number of mounted archers. But this was a doomed attempt to catch up with a dangerous enemy on his own turf, using methods completely alien to European military culture. The fundamental problem was that a simple Roman farmer from Italy would never become as skilled a rider as a natural-born steppe warrior. In ancient times, stirrups had not yet been invented, so staying on a galloping horse while wearing heavy iron armor during a charge required years of muscle memory. You can give a European infantryman a bow and a horse, but you cannot instantly create a centuries-old culture of complex horsemanship by government decree. The United States fell into exactly the same logical trap in our time when it attempted to create a modern Afghan army in its own Western image and likeness. The US Pentagon spent colossal billions of dollars, spending years training local soldiers to NATO standards of conventional combat and generously supplying them with the most sophisticated equipment. But as soon as American air support, high-tech maintenance bases, and complex logistics disappeared, this expensive, artificial army fell apart in literally a matter of days. The Roman Empire, desperately trying to wage someone else's Persian war, rapidly lost its legendary infantry discipline and failed to acquire genuine cavalry skills. And this growing systemic crisis of Roman military identity ultimately reached its emotional peak in Julian the Apostate's desperate campaign. We return to the very scene with which we began our story. The year is 363 on the banks of the Tigris River, and Emperor Julian the Apostate gazes at the burning ships that were meant to supply his army. Julian was a brilliant commander who had previously crushed the Germanic tribes in Gaul with ease using classical Roman discipline. He believed that his personal charisma, classical education, and the patronage of the ancient pagan gods would help him crush the Sassanids. By burning his fleet, he sought to emulate Alexander the Great's legendary gesture, cutting off his legion's route of retreat. But Julian had forgotten the most important rule of logistics. Alexander fought under different conditions, and you cannot win in the desert without food. This order marked the culmination of Rome's misunderstanding of the Eastern theatre of war. Julian believed that fear would compel his soldiers to fight more fiercely, and that they would quickly capture the enemy's capital, along with its supplies. But the Persian king Shapur too employed an old tactic, proven over centuries. He simply withdrew his main forces deep into the country. The Romans found themselves in a scorched desert, without a fleet, without food, surrounded by swarms of elusive enemy cavalry. The soldiers marched in heavy armor under the scorching sun, slowly losing their minds from exhaustion and the constant anticipation of an attack. The psychological breakdown of an army deprived of logistical support occurs rapidly and irreversibly. Imagine a unit of American special forces that was dropped into the Afghan mountains and suddenly cut off from communications, evacuation, and water supplies. No matter how professional they may be, after 3 days without water, all their tactical training will become meaningless. The human body has physiological limits that do not bow to the orders of emperors or presidents. Julian realized his mistake too late, when his mighty army had turned into an exhausted mob, capable only of fending off ambushes. Retreat was their only chance for survival, but retreating under the onslaught of the Sassanid cataphracts was tantamount to suicide. In one such skirmish involving Julian's rearguard, he rushed into battle in haste, forgetting to put on his armor. A spear thrown by an unknown horseman amid the chaos of the cavalry clash pierced his liver. Legend has it that as he lay dying, he flung a handful of his own blood into the sky, exclaiming, "You have won, Galilean," acknowledging defeat not only at the hands of the Persians, but also at the hands of Christianity. His successor, Jovian, was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast territories to the Sassanids, simply to bring the survivors home. 700 years of Roman military strategy went up in flames on that campaign, just as brilliantly as Julian's ships on the Tigris River. Rome never managed to defeat Parthia and Persia because it refused to acknowledge the limits of its own competence. Heavy infantry is a tool for capturing cities and holding fixed front lines in densely populated regions. In asymmetric warfare, where space is infinite and the enemy is not tied to infrastructure, this tool becomes your greatest weakness. The world's strongest army loses not because it is weak, but because its type of force cannot be applied to the task at hand. This is a systemic error in perception that survived the Roman Empire and has lived on to this day in the offices of the Pentagon. Afghanistan is often called the graveyard of empires, but this is merely a metaphor concealing a deeper strategic truth. Both Mesopotamia for Rome and the Hindu Kush Mountains for the United States became traps not because of some mystical curse, but because of mundane logistics and the incompatibility of military doctrines. When a superpower attempts to destroy an asymmetric adversary, it is like striking a swarm of bees with a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer is enormous, but the bees are faster, and it is impossible to crush them with a single blow. The Romans built roads and forts in the desert. The Americans built forward operating bases, FOBs, and helicopter landing pads in the mountains, but the essence remained the same. Both empires tried to impose their ironclad order on chaos, and both bled to death trying to maintain that order. The history of Crassus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and Julian is not a story of cowardly soldiers or inferior weapons. The legionnaires were the finest fighters of their time, just like modern Marines who give their lives in foreign lands. But when political ambitions force an army to fight under conditions that nullify its key advantages, defeat becomes only a matter of time. Rome stagnated for 700 years because it refused to understand a simple truth. Not every war can be won simply by sending in more heavy infantry. And when the last American helicopter left Kabul, somewhere in history, a Roman centurion who had been left behind forever in the Parthian sands smiled sadly.